folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got another Roundup post for you guys. 6 albums I've just been listening to for the past 3 or 4 weeks. These are just sort of superficial overviews of these albums, nothing too deep or in depth for now. The idea is to maybe just whet your appetite, get you interested in checking out these albums on your own, and maybe give me some inspiration for some deep dive reviews at a later date. So let's go and get started out with Mammoth WVH's second album, Mammoth II. This is Wolfgang Van Halen's follow-up to his massively successful debut album from a couple years ago. And it's always tricky when you have a sophomore album because you either have to do kind of more of the same or you have to do something completely different. And it's a tricky situation to do either one, of course. Wolfgang Van Halen, of course, leans into his already established hard rock style and kind of gives us more of the same. But he's so darn good at it that it really doesn't matter. The quality of the material that he has on this album is easily the equal of the first album, but it's not in any way a note-for-note rehash of his first album. As a matter of fact, he innovates in several pretty important ways on this one, not the least of which is kind of unearths his own chops in a little bit more clear fashion. Wolfgang Van Halen's approach to the Mammoth project has really been to showcase his songwriting and sort of his overall musicianship, in an attempt to sort of, I think, distance himself from the virtuosic shredding that is associated with his name. But having already established himself as a really great songwriter and a person with his own identity outside of the sort of burden of his own last name, is coming out of his shell a little bit and showing a little bit more of his own chops. You'll hear him play some stuff in this album that's very much in alignment with some of the styles that his father laid out in the late 70s and the early 80s. And also uses some of his father's equipment in this album. So a little bit less worried about what people think, I think, about him leaning into his own legacy. But at the same time really still holds down the fort on his own identity as a musician. Next up I got Witch's Zango.
Fucking cola, fucking cola, fucking cola. Fucking cola, fucking cola, fucking cola. Ove mana ove mana ove mana ove mana ove mana ove mana Waile, waile, waile.
Witch is a Zambian band that came into prominence in the early 70s and was kind of the spearhead of this movement called Zam Rock. And Witch's early albums just recently enjoyed a re-release. And the interest that's kind of been generated by those releases caused the band to reform with a slightly different lineup from then and create this wildly, I think, successful album, Zango. Now, Zango has a real vintage feel to it, and that not only has to do with having some of the original players of the band, although not all of them are the original players. They also went back to the original studio in which they recorded these early albums and dusted off all the old equipment. And literally, there's soldering and duct tape involved in getting these old boards to work. But they brought them back up to working capacity and recorded this album using all that equipment. And what you'll notice, I think, most about Witch is that they really do try to mine more of a rock approach than a lot of other contemporary African pop bands from the 70s. And particularly if you're a fan of early Funkadelic, I think there'd be a lot for you to like on this album. And of course, if you're a fan of African rock in general from the 70s, this sort of reinvention of the band, I think, is particularly compelling. Next up, I got Anamanaguchi's Endless Fantasy. Anamanaguchi is a chiptune band, and they specialize in this sort of hypercolor, high-intensity, fun pop music, mostly instrumental. The most visible thing that they've done is the Scott Pilgrim Saves the World soundtrack. And that same sort of high-intensity, bright, fun poppy music that's on that soundtrack is all over this album too. Now, the good news about this album is that it's wildly consistent. If you like the sound and the feel of any of their songs, I think that Anamanaguchi will pay off for you in the long run. The downside of it is that consistency, because since it has this sense of everything sort of being as bright and as hyper real as possible, that its sources of wear a little bit thin by the end of the album. There's a sense that even though the songs have different melodies and different approaches, they have a lot of the same timbre and the same dynamic levels to them. It's still a fun ride along the way, and I really can't say anything bad about any of the songs on the album. Okay, next up I got Robert Plant, the Lullaby and the Ceaseless World.
Lucky charm, I dressed it up with love. I crossed the 7 seas to you. Will it be enough? And I will be a rainbow. Oh, now your storm is gone. And I will bring the song for you. And I will carry on.
This is another album that I had in my collection I sort of unearthed from a decade or so ago. I listened to it a couple times when I had it, and again, it just sort of got lost in the shuffle of the other things that I was listening to. And coming back and just revisiting it earlier this year, it really came to me that I need to delve further into it. There's a lot more to this album than I gave credit for. And going back and re-listening to this album not only caused me to reevaluate its worth, but also, like, Robert Plant as a solo musician, I feel like he's one of those guys that's kind of underrated as a solo artist, but he did some really, really amazing albums in the 80s, and has taken different twists and turns in his path, always being led by his own curiosity and his own love of music. And I think one of the things that's successful about this album was that at the time that it was released, he had a pretty well-established live band that had been traveling with him on all of his touring. And he really cultivated a collaborative relationship within this band in the creation of this album. And the people in his band are very diverse. There's an African drummer, and there's a guy who's into this kind of music. There's a guy into soundtracks. There's a guy who's into looping. And they all kind of threw ideas in the pot. So it's not just a Robert Plant solo album, but it's a Robert Plant album that is the result of a collaboration of the musicians that he surrounded himself with. And I always think that environment is one of the best ways that you can go. I think the collaboration is super important in music, and I have a lot of respect for Robert Plant being such an established musician and still being open to that level of collaboration. And it pays off, I think, on this album. Okay, next up I got Hooray for Earth's Fantasy Something.
I tell you what I'm thinking, you will go away through the feelings in the moment. I believe this, I believe it. If I
Now, again, in the early aughts, I was a really big fan of
Hooray for Earth.
when they released the True Loves album. That album has kind of weathered so well in the long run for me. It probably has its own sort of hidden gem, personal classic status in the big picture of things. So I was really surprised to find that Hooray for Earth, who I thought had kind of dissolved, released this new mini album, 35-minute album, earlier this year. And it's still, after over a decade, sounds very much like the same kind of washed out reverb sound that you see on True Loves. But what you do see, I think, on Fantasy Something, it's a little bit of an innovation, is that it's a little bit less about pop songwriting. There are pop songs on here, don't get me wrong. It's very melodic and it's very accessible, and you'll hum these songs after you listen to them just a couple of times. But there's also, I think, a little bit more of an experimental bent on this album, and there's more of a, I hate to say noisy, but there's almost like more chaos to it, embedded within the big walls of reverb and effects that drive the Hooray for Earth sound. And finally, I got Beverly Glenn Copeland's The Ones Ahead.
Dark night turning, beneath the star fields burning. I see the ones ahead, circling on the river, around the teacher, the giver. I see their hearts and all the fear they've shed. They beckon me, come. Love can...
Beverly Glenn Copeland is a songwriter and a vocalist with a pretty long history. I've only just been introduced to him through this album. There's definitely a deep-seated belief that Beverly Glenn Copeland has in the goodness of humanity, and that comes out in the music almost to the detriment. It almost feels like it's very heavy-handed. Clearly, Beverly Glenn Copeland has a background in gospel styles, and those songs I do find appealing. But the ones that I really enjoyed the most is a couple tracks on here that are kind of Africa influenced and African inspired by African music. And I really like those songs the most. Those are the ones that really drew me into the album. But they're really kind of outliers in the big picture. The overall tone is a sort of a mellow, gospel-influenced album. But I think that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify and put these tracks up. Big 2023 playlist you can use to put on shuffle, just have in the background and check out all the stuff that's been happening in my rotation this year. And also these albums are going to be part of Tier 6, looking at my best albums of 2023. And if you want to be involved in the process of finding out what the best albums of 2023 are, please subscribe to my Patreon below. Until you see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.